Hello, we are going to be discussing Chapter 1 in our book, and the chapter title is A Brief Historical Perspective on Intercollegiate Athletics. The more things change, the more they stay the same. There is a striking similarity in topics and issues when comparing headlines from today's news with those that appeared in the news 100 years ago. In 1905, Bill Reed, the Harvard football coach, discussed the issues that went along with the job, such as managing the media, dealing with questions about his salary, apparently it was too high, student-athlete eligibility, and student-athletes getting into trouble. What's interesting is that top coaches in the modern era, such as Nick Saban at Alabama, deal with very similar issues today. There are, however, some notable differences. And some of these things have emerged in the evolving American college landscape. For example, colleges and universities used to be dominated by males, but now most are co-ed, and on many campuses, actually, female students are in the majority. Similarly, racial segregation has now given way to integrated campuses. And as these changes occurred, athletics programs have also changed and evolved. While it might be hard to believe now, there was a time when football was not the primary sport in America. Back in the 1850s, football was still decades away from its dominance as a major college sport. Intercollegiate athletics actually got its start from a rowing regatta, of all things. It was patterned after the Oxford and Cambridge regatta in England. This one featured 3 rowing teams from Yale and 1 from Harvard. The race was held on Lake Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire in front of an audience of roughly 1,000 spectators. In addition to the rowing, there were several ancillary events connected with the race day, including a lunch, a gala dinner and dance after the events, and an award ceremony. This successful regatta became the model for future regattas, and it also contributed to the growth of intercollegiate athletics on college campuses. As intercollegiate athletics grew, questions arose about who should run them and how they should be run. Up through the early 1900s, intercollegiate athletics for men were run as student-led organizations similar to college club teams today. There were several different financial models. Sometimes the teams would collect membership dues. Other times they would approach businesses for sponsorships of teams and events. Still other times they would do things like selling tickets to contests, and they would also do things that were promotional fundraising campaigns. Some of you may have heard the term land-grant university and wondered what it meant. It's based on the Morrill Land-Grant Acts of 1862 and 1890. This federal law gave states public lands with the stipulation that the land had to be sold or used for profit, and that the proceeds were used to establish at least one college or university. Hence the term land-grant college. These colleges would teach agriculture and the mechanical arts. As a result of the Morrill Land-Grant Acts, educational institutions rapidly expanded across the country. This led to greater competitions for students and increasing pressure to move away from a classical curriculum in favor of more practical skills such as business. In turn, college administrators began advertising to increase enrollment. And what they realized was that college sport became a means of differentiating themselves from their competitors and appealing to the broader society. Although baseball, basketball, tennis, track and field, and wrestling were all popular on college campuses, the sport of football began to gain status and popularity. Colleges were first focused on commercialism, and football was a natural fit. Colleges built stadiums for the purposes of generating gate receipts and drawing large numbers of people to campuses. They wanted to cultivate media attention, and they wanted to forge relationships with boosters and sponsors. Amid these changes, student leadership of college sports would give way to professional coaches who are hired to bring a scientific approach to coaching and performance. The 1904 football season presented a major crisis in American college football, as there were 21 player deaths and more than 200 serious injuries. There were calls to reform football or abolish football altogether. Moved by the public outrage, President Theodore Roosevelt got involved in the issue, although since he was a sports enthusiast, he favored reforming football, not abolishing it. In 1905, Roosevelt convened the members of the American Intercollegiate Football Rules Committee to discuss the future of the game of football at the college level. That committee failed to come up with a solution, and they had to go back to the drawing board. Subsequently, in future meetings, they actually formed the Intercollegiate Athletic Association of the United States. So now this was an organization that was interested in all intercollegiate athletics, not just football. This organization was later renamed the National Collegiate Athletic Association in 1912. The NCAA, upon its birth, adopted a definition of amateurism based on the British universities such as Oxford and Cambridge. Consistent with the British standard, members were expected to avoid practices that violated amateurism principles, especially offering incentives to players on the basis of their athletic abilities. Member institutions were expected to follow these rules, although enforcement was left to the individual institutions, who were supposed to follow a code of honor. This enforcement structure came to be known as home rule, in which institutions made their own determinations about how to abide by NCAA rules. This led to all sorts of violations as different schools made different determinations about the rules. As I introduced on the previous slide, the NCAA Amateur Code of the 1920s through the 1940s was known as home rule. In theory, it embraced sport participation as an avocation and trusted that schools would enforce themselves. But in reality, it became unenforceable. Certain parts of the membership, as well as external influences, did not fully endorse the code. Not surprisingly, in this era of college sport, there was an emergence of an underground economy in which college athletes were paid under the table in the form of shady jobs, loans, athletic scholarships, and money. In 1948, the NCAA passed the Principles for the Conduct of Intercollegiate Athletics, which later became known as the Sanity Code. The Sanity Code was supposed to be a compromise between Southern schools that offered athletes full athletic scholarships, such as Maryland and Virginia, and Northern schools that were opposed to scholarships, such as Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. The Sanity Code of 1948 required that awarding financial aid for athletic talent required that awards had to be need-based, meaning that recipients had to demonstrate financial need. The awards were viewed as gifts, which helped avoid potential problems associated with pay for play. Almost as soon as the Sanity Code had been inserted into the NCAA Constitution, allegations began to rumble among the membership that the code was unenforceable. So apparently everything was unenforceable back then. So this crisis continued to mount when the Compliance Committee announced that 20 institutions were violating rules. However, the only sanction for violating the Sanity Code was expulsion from the NCAA, which was deemed too harsh of a punishment and was actually never used. So in the early 1950s, the Sanity Code came to an end, and the NCAA had to figure out another arrangement to handle subsidizing student athletes. By 1957, NCAA rules permitted universities to pay for an athlete's room, board, tuition, and fees. The scholarship was a 4-year agreement, regardless of the athlete's contributions on the field or court. However, 15 years later, scholarship rules changed again, and now athletic scholarships were just a 1-year renewable award. This actually increased pressure on student athletes, and it gave a lot more power to the coaches. So it's crazy to think that we've had 12 slides already, and yet this is the first time that we're going to be talking about women in intercollegiate sport. But you know, the prevailing wisdom at the time was that women were the weaker sex, and that if a woman were to be physically active, that her ovaries wouldn't function properly. This is honestly what was the wisdom out there that doctors would be talking about, that if a woman was doing something too strenuous physically, that she might impair her reproductive capabilities. And so they really, in terms of the culture, they wanted to make sure that women did not participate in anything too physically demanding or too challenging. So in the 1890s, when Senda Berenson was the director of PE at Smith College, She needed to adapt the rules of basketball to suit female players and make sure that they didn't strain their reproductive organs. So she reworked the dimensions of the court into 3 sections, and then the women wouldn't have to run full court. So they would have an offense, a middle zone, and a defense. It's crazy to think about now, but back then, this was the only way that women would be permitted to participate in competitive sports such as basketball. Fast forward 50 or so years, and in 1957, the Division of Girls and Women in Sport, which is the DGWS, recognized the necessity of meeting the needs of highly skilled female athletes with competitive opportunities. And I think that this came about thanks to a lot of things, including the momentum of the women's movements and the rise of feminism. And basically, society became more comfortable with women participating in varsity competition. 1972 included the passage of Title IX, as well as the creation of the Association of Intercollegiate Athletics for Women. By 1980, 1981, the NCAA took over the AIAW and began hosting championships in women's sports at the Division I, II, and III levels. So long gone are the days of student-led clubs and athletes running themselves. Now we have this profession of athletic administration, and there are some well-established professional organizations for the different levels of athletic administrators. And I wanted to share a few of them with you in case being an athletic administrator or being an athletic director is one of your career goals. And so you could look into these and see what the organization is all about. So the first one is NACDA, which is the National Association of Collegiate Directors of Athletics. It was founded in 1965, and its mission is to provide athletic administrators with an organization that fosters networking, exchange of ideas, and professional development. Then there's the NIAA, and that's the National Interscholastic Athletic Administrators Association. It was founded in 1971, and it's for professionals administering athletic programs in our nation's high schools and middle schools. And then I wanted to include a local example. It's known as NEPSAC, and this stands for the New England Prep School Athletic Council. It was established in 1942, which is crazy to think about, it's a long time ago, as an organization of athletic directors from accredited New England independent schools.